Barron's AEG turbine factory was a seminal building. It was enormously influential. There isn't an architect in Europe, a modern architect in Europe, who wasn't influenced by the building. One of those was Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius, of course, would later become the founder and the first director of the Bauhaus, the school in Germany. And later, when Gropius left the Bauhaus, he would become the director of architecture at the Graduate School of Design. But we're at a time much before that. The young Walter Gropius worked for Peter Behrens exactly at the time that the design of the AEG factory was underway. And of course, Gropius absorbed many of Behrens's ideas. Gropius would eventually become much more interested in sort of technical rationalism, industrialized processes of construction, the mass production of building components. Behrens was never really interested in that kind of technology. But nevertheless, Gropius shared Behrens's position that technology had to be transformed by spirit, that architecture was not just building, but was building raised to the level of art, and that the intellectual task of the architect in modernity was to invent new forms of a new machine age that would not only understand architecture as representing a social totality, but that would also put architecture in the continuum of architecture as an art practice. What I now want to look at very briefly is a project that Gropius did early in his career, just after leaving Behrens's office, that shows how the seminal ideas of the AEG factory could be transformed, elaborated, varied, and even in some way criticized, but still continued as part of a general aesthetic project of designing the factory building. This is Gropius's building for the Fagus Factory, which was a small factory which manufactured shoe lasts, that is, these wooden inserts around which a shoe is constructed. It was a very high level, high quality, known for high quality products, and the owner of the Fagus Factory wanted, again, like AEG had before, wanted to use the factory as a kind of advertisement for the quality of the production of the corporation itself. Gropius, unlike Behrens, did not have control of the entire factory. He was only asked to do what amounts to a kind of addition, but it was the main building, it was the face of the factory toward the street. He starts very much like Behrens, putting his attention on the glass wall and on the masonry construction that supports the glass wall. The corners, as in the turbine factory, are still a kind of primary anchor for the building. But the big difference is where Behrens had used concrete on the corners, even though it's true that the concrete was set back and the idea of its load-bearing properties was put into a kind of ambiguity or a tension. In Gropius's case, though the corners still kind of anchor the composition, the corners are emphatically transparent. They're sharply constructed. The glass and steel come together at very sharp points. At the corner, the glass bay is bent exactly in half so that the glass seems to wrap around the corner. It looks very familiar to the contemporary eye, but this was so original that the contractors and the builders of the factory had a very hard time even understanding how they would build this to actually make those glass corners stand up. Again, following these ideas of contrast between the opaque and the transparent that Behrens developed, Gropius also sort of pushes in a solid masonry block that contains the entry to the building, sort of pushes it into that glass envelope or that glass membrane. Another difference, in almost like a reversal, is that while Behrens canted the glass at a slight angle and kept the face of the columns, in his case steel columns, straight, Gropius does in a way the opposite. The glass face is emphatically vertical and plumb, and it's the masonry piers that are battered so that they seem to lean in. This does two things. At the very top part of the building, it brings the face out well in front of its masonry support so that the glass seems to hang like a thin curtain from the top parapet. But the other thing it does is it casts a shadow, and it makes it look like the glass planes are kind of cut or sheared and are almost freestanding. Like barons in the front part of the AEG, this technique of isolating the plane of glass puts enormous visual emphasis on the glass as this tactile plane. In Barron's case, though it's not properly a curtain wall of glass, the pane was continuous, but it only went through one story. As high as the turbine factory is, it's only a single story. Gropius is working with, though it's a smaller building, it's 3 stories, but he makes it look as if the glass curtain wall goes all the way through 3 stories. This is very dramatic because it is one of the first times that this technique was used. He wants it to look like the glass is continuous in hanging, when in fact it's actually 3 separate panels. And then finally, he puts the staircases in the corner of the building, wrapped by this glass curtain wall. The visitor can see these freestanding staircases behind the glass wall even before he enters the building. Now, the effect of battering the brick piers and thereby getting the glass to set in front of the brick piers, and also by making the glass in the same plane as the parapet and in front of the base. The visual effect of all that is to make it seem like there's an entire plane of glass hanging from the parapet rather than resting on the base. The visual effect is that of what we call a curtain wall. Now, a proper curtain wall, as we see in any contemporary skyscraper, is actually a continuous network of glass that stands in front of the structure. In the case of the Fagus Factory, it's not a proper curtain wall in that sense. The individual panes of glass are still attached to the structure just behind them. But the appearance, the visual appearance, is that they're hanging free of the structure. And this is very clear that it was more important to Gropius to get that appearance than it was the empirical fact of a curtain wall. While Gropius would insist that, like Behrens, he wants his building to be seen in a continuum that begins with classical architecture and runs through modern times, through what amounts to a kind of critique of Behrens' system, he manages to design a variation that we might think of as even more modern than the AEG factory, moving architecture even further to an industrial glass and steel aesthetic.